A 25-year-old international student full of ambition moves to Australia to build her future. She lives with her family, her aunt, uncle, and cousin, in a home she believed was her safest refuge. But then one day, after a simple afternoon of shopping, she suddenly vanished. 4 days passed. Her uncle accompanied his wife to the police station to file a missing persons report. But what no one could have known was that the very person reporting her missing was the one holding the darkest secret of all. Her body was discovered floating at a tourist spot, miles away, the victim of a brutal attack with nearly 40 wounds. The killer was not a random stranger in the shadows. It was someone she called family. This is the shocking case of Michelle Leng, a story of the most depraved betrayal hidden in the one place she should have been safest. We are going to dive deep into every chilling detail and analyze the complex psychology of the killer in this case. If you believe these stories need to be told to bring justice for the victims, please hit that like button to support us. And most importantly, hit subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss a single moment of this horrifying journey into the truth. In the sprawling, vibrant suburbs of Sydney, a young woman named Madeleine was carefully building a new life for herself, thousands of miles from the familiar sights and sounds of her home in Chengdu, China. She was 25 years old, a bright international student with a future that seemed to stretch out before her, full of promise. To her new friends and classmates in Australia, she was simply and warmly known as Michelle. Michelle was an only child, a circumstance that had forged an unbreakable, profound bond with her mother, May. This connection had grown even deeper, becoming a source of immense strength for them both after the year 2008, when they faced the heartbreaking loss of Michelle's father. In the quiet aftermath of their shared grief, they became more than just mother and daughter. They were each other's closest confidant, a steadfast, two-person family facing the world as a united front. Her mother, May, would later describe her daughter as a soul brimming with a rare and tremendous compassion. Michelle, she recalled, was someone who felt everything for everyone else, a person who seemed to carry the weight of others' sorrows and celebrate their joys as if they were her very own. No matter what personal stress or sadness she might be grappling with in her own life, she always, without fail, found the strength to be that supportive friend, that steady and reassuring presence in the lives of those she cared about. It was in the year 2011 that Michelle made the brave, life-altering decision to move to Australia to pursue her studies. The thought of her only child moving halfway across the world naturally filled May with a deep nervousness, a knot of worry that any loving parent would understand. But that quiet anxiety was completely overshadowed by an immense, swelling sense of pride. She saw in Michelle a fierce and admirable determination to push beyond the boundaries of her comfort zone, to grow, and to chase down the future she was so carefully designing for herself. This dream was a shared one, built upon the foundation of a mother's unwavering belief and profound sacrifice. May had poured every last penny she possessed into helping Michelle make this monumental journey, investing not just her life savings, but all of her hopes into her daughter's future. She was incredibly excited, filled with a quiet, certain anticipation, to simply watch from afar as Michelle achieved everything she knew her bright, compassionate, and fiercely determined daughter was destined to become. Upon setting foot in Australia, Michelle was thankfully not cast adrift in an entirely foreign land. She had the profound comfort of a pre-existing family connection, a foundational support system that awaited her arrival. She moved into a home with her aunt, her uncle, and her cousin. Their residence was located in Campsie, a dynamic and diverse suburb nestled within the state of New South Wales. This house was not merely a place to stay. It became her sanctuary, her new home base, a place that should have represented unconditional safety, surrounded as she was by people she considered family. For her mother, May, watching from afar in China, this arrangement must have provided an immeasurable sense of peace, knowing her only daughter was not alone but was, in fact, being looked after by relatives. With the characteristic determination that had defined her entire journey, Michelle set about establishing her new life. The transcript notes that as soon as she was on her feet and settled, she began a ritual that spoke volumes of her character. She found work, balancing the intense demands of her university education with the necessity of earning an income, and from that income she meticulously saved every single spare penny she could. This money was not for her own luxuries or comforts. In a touching and profound display of gratitude and enduring love, she sent it all back home to her mom, May. This was her way of honoring the immense sacrifices her mother had made. A tangible repayment of the faith and life savings that May had poured into her daughter's dream. It was a quiet, consistent promise kept across the ocean, a testament to her selflessness and the unbreakable bond they shared. Let us now move forward in time, to the year 2016. 5 full and transformative years had passed since Michelle, as a younger woman, had first arrived. The passage of that time had seen her blossom. She was no longer a nervous newcomer acclimatizing to a foreign shore. She was a confident and integrated resident of Sydney. She had successfully navigated the complex social and cultural currents of her new environment and had built a life that was truly her own. The transcript makes a special note of this, stating that she loved where she lived. This was a life of her own making, rich with experience and connection. Her world was full. That compassionate nature her mother spoke of had drawn people to her effortlessly. She had cultivated a great group of friends, a vibrant social circle that formed another layer of her support system. She was not an isolated student who lived only in the library. She was a cherished friend, a bright personality who was deeply embedded in her community. But it was perhaps in her studies that her drive and intellect shone the brightest. The transcript confirms that she was excelling in her studies, a simple phrase that encompassed a mountain of hard work. Her academic record was a testament to her ambition. She had already successfully navigated the rigors of a full business degree, graduating from the highly regarded University of Technology, Sydney. For many, this would have been a crowning achievement in itself, the culmination of their educational journey. But for Michelle, it was merely a stepping stone. Her ambition was not yet satisfied. With that degree in hand, she had immediately enrolled herself in a new, and arguably even more demanding, field of study. She began classes at the Sydney Institute of Interpreting and Translation. This difficult discipline, requiring a nimble and precise mind, signaled her desire to build a career as a skilled communicator, a bridge between the cultures and languages that defined her life. By all measures, in the early months of 2016, Michelle Leng was a resounding success story. A brilliant scholar, a devoted daughter, and a happy, thriving young woman. The day was April 21st, in the year 2016. It began wrapped in the comforting, familiar rhythm of Michelle's life as a student. It was a Thursday, and the transcript describes the air as holding the comfortable warmth of a pleasant afternoon. After finishing her academic commitments for the day, Michelle met up with a couple of her friends. We can imagine them standing outside the University of Technology, perhaps laughing and discussing their plans for the coming weekend, completely unaware that this ordinary moment was, in fact, a final one. They said their goodbyes, and her friends waved her off as she boarded a bus, watching her disappear into the afternoon traffic. She had told them her plans, and they were simple enough. She was going out shopping. Her chosen destination was the bustling heart of Sydney's retail world, Pitt Street Mall. She went alone, but this was nothing unusual. She was a confident and independent young woman, perfectly comfortable in her adopted city. The transcript notes that she stayed there for a while, allowing herself the simple pleasure of browsing by herself, drifting from one store to the next. She was seen on security video, a silent electronic witness to these final, mundane hours. The footage captured her inside the large Meijer department store right in the mall, the clock on the recording reading 3 o'clock in the afternoon. While she was there, she picked up a few things, though what they were, we do not know. That same security footage, later pored over by investigators searching for any clue, preserved her image in time. It showed what she was wearing that day. A casual outfit of jeans paired with a long-sleeved gray top. On her shoulder, she carried a red bag, the only splash of bright color in her ensemble. At some point during her time at the mall, she bought herself a juice, a small, refreshing purchase on a warm day. In these moments, she was just another shopper in the crowd, anonymous and safe, completely unaware of what was to come. When her shopping was done, it was time to make the familiar journey home. She made her way to the nearby St. James station. The transcript indicates she boarded her train just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This was her regular commute, the train that would carry her from the city's bustling center back to the quiet suburb of Campsie. The journey itself was uneventful. At precisely 4:30 in the afternoon, Michelle disembarked at Campsie Station. She was home. All that was left was the final, short walk back to her apartment, the home she shared with her family, the place that should have been her sanctuary. During that late afternoon, as Michelle made her way home from Campsie Station, she was still connected to her world. The transcript states that she was actively chatting to her friends, a digital conversation that mirrored the countless others she had every day. Her phone was alive, a familiar bridge to her social circle. We can picture her texting, perhaps sharing a detail about her shopping trip or making plans for the weekend, all the mundane, fleeting communications that stitch a life together. Her friends, on the other end of those messages, would have had no reason to suspect these were the final words they would ever exchange with her. And then, with a chilling and inexplicable suddenness, there was nothing. The conversation did not just trail off, it stopped. The digital line went dead. This was the precise moment the silence began, a silence that would stretch from hours into agonizing days. In the immediate aftermath, this lack of response might not have seemed alarming. Perhaps her phone battery had died. Perhaps she had gotten home and was busy with her family, her aunt, uncle, and cousin. But as the evening wore on, that silence began to feel heavy and wrong. The transcript notes the stark details of this sudden void. First, there was no answer on her phone. We can imagine the rising concern of her friends. Their messages, once delivered and read, now sat unanswered. Their calls, once greeted by her familiar voice, now just rang and rang, echoing into an empty void before perhaps being diverted to voicemail. This was the first broken link in the chain of her daily life. Even more troubling was the state of her digital footprint. Michelle was described as having always active social media. This was a young woman of her generation who lived and shared her experiences online. Her friends would have instinctively checked these feeds, perhaps WeChat, Instagram, or Facebook, expecting to see a photo from her shopping trip at Pitt Street Mall or a simple post about her day. But there was nothing. Her accounts, usually a vibrant stream of her thoughts, studies, and social life, were completely static. This digital stillness was a profound deviation from her character. When the sun rose the next morning, this unsettling digital absence was compounded by a stark physical one. Michelle, the diligent student, had no sign of her on campus. Her classmates and friends, the ones who had waved her off just the day before, would have looked for her in lecture halls and the library. Her non-attendance was not just a missed class, it was another, more concrete piece of evidence that something was terribly wrong. The transcript highlights that this very sudden disappearance was a red flag for everyone who knew her. Her friends and fellow students felt it, a cold prickle of fear. They knew this was not Michelle. This was not her behavior. And yet, a strange and baffling inertia took hold. The transcript states with a chilling matter-of-factness that several days passed with no one reporting her missing. This gap is a mystery in itself. Perhaps her friends, worried as they were, assumed her family must know where she was. Perhaps they believed she was safe within the walls of her home in Campsie, and they were hesitant to overstep by calling the authorities. This agonizing period of inaction finally broke 4 days after she was last seen shopping. The catalyst, according to the transcript, was Michelle's aunt, who returned home from a weekend away. This detail is crucial. It implies the aunt had not been in the apartment when Michelle returned that fateful Thursday, nor had she been there for the entire weekend that followed. She walked back into her home, perhaps expecting to find her niece studying, only to be alarmed to learn that her niece had just vanished. The aunt's reaction was immediate and decisive. Unlike the friends who had waited, she understood the gravity of the situation. The transcript tells us she went right to the police station, and she did not go alone. She was accompanied with her husband, Derek. It was Derek Barrett, Michelle's uncle, the man she lived with, who walked into that police station beside his wife to file the official missing person report for the young woman whose terrible fate he alone already knew. With the missing person report now officially active, the police began the meticulous and urgent process of piecing together Michelle's last known movements. They immediately reached out to her circle of friends and fellow students, the people who had formed her close-knit community in Sydney. When questioned, her friends were unified in their accounts. Nothing had seemed amiss on that final Thursday. According to the transcript, they confirmed that nothing Michelle said or did had stood out that day. She was, in every respect, just her usual self. This lack of any apparent distress, any warning sign, only served to deepen the growing mystery. Investigators then turned to the silent, objective witnesses of the city, the vast network of security cameras. They began tracing her path, pulling footage from the university, the transit system, and the retail district. The tapes they recovered confirmed the timeline. Michelle was clearly visible on the security video from the Meyer department store in the Pitt Street Mall, the timestamp reading 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The footage provided a clear image of her, detailing what she was wearing: jeans, a long-sleeved gray top, and a distinctive red bag carried on her shoulder. Crucially, the detectives watched this footage for any sign of danger. They observed her browsing in the shops, and the transcript confirms she wasn't being followed by anyone. Her body language showed no sign of alarm. She did not seem outwardly distressed or upset. She was simply alone, going about her day. The cameras captured her buying a juice before she moved on. The trail continued to St. James Station, where she was seen boarding a train at 4:30 in the afternoon, and further footage confirmed she disembarked at her home station in Campsie. Her close friends reiterated to the police that their contact with her, their digital chat, had continued until late on that Thursday night, and then abruptly stopped. She had made it back to her suburb. She was moments from her front door, and then she had vanished. As Michelle's image began to circulate on social media, fueled by the growing concern of her friends, the local news cycle was suddenly interrupted. News stations, broadcasting from locations over 60 miles away, had just begun reporting on a different and deeply troubling story. At this point, the two events were entirely separate. One was a missing person case in Sydney, the other a grim discovery on the coast. No one had any reason to connect them. This second story was unfolding at the Snapper Point Blowhole, a location on the New South Wales Central Coast. It is a place of stunning, rugged beauty, a popular spot for tourists, but it is also notoriously dangerous. The area is defined by treacherous, slippery rocks and sharp, jagged edges. It is a place, the transcript notes, where someone could easily fall in, hurt themselves, and even drown. On this morning, one such tourist, walking the area, looked down and spotted something in the churning water. After looking closer, they were struck with a horrifying realization. It was a person. They were not swimming. They were floating face down and, as the tourist reported, they looked dead. Emergency services were called immediately. At 10:30 in the morning, a paramedic was lowered into the water from a helicopter to retrieve the body. When the body was recovered, it was clear this was no accident. The victim was deceased. The paramedic, lowered from the helicopter into that violent, churning water, reached the still figure. The transcript confirms that upon retrieval, it was immediately clear this was a deceased person. But even more than that, it was instantly obvious that this was no tragic accidental death. This was not a tourist who had slipped on the treacherous rocks. This was not a swimmer caught in the unforgiving current. This was something far darker. The victim was a young woman. As they brought her body from the water, the full horror of the situation revealed itself to the investigators on the scene. The transcript describes a chilling and deeply disturbing sight. The young woman was completely naked. Every piece of clothing, every item that could identify her, was gone, and her body was covered in stab wounds. This was not the result of an accident. It was the clear and unambiguous mark of extreme personal violence. The subsequent post-mortem examination would confirm the sheer brutality of the attack. The transcript states she had been stabbed almost 40 times. The fatal wound, the one that ended her life, had been delivered to her throat. There was more. The evidence on her body told a silent story of her final, desperate moments. The transcript notes that she had clearly tried hard to fight her killer off. She had not been a passive victim. She had fought for her life. The investigators were left to contemplate the incredibly violent and frightening death she must have endured. It was a scene of almost unimaginable cruelty, and it presented the police with a complex and urgent mystery. Who was this woman, and who could have committed such a monstrous act? The detectives began to analyze the scene itself, looking for clues in the geography of the blowhole. The first and most obvious theory was that she had been attacked elsewhere and her body had simply washed up onto these rocks. But the lead detective chief inspector quickly dismissed this. The transcript records his crucial observation. On that day, there were particularly heavy seas. The water was rough, powerful enough to dash a body against the jagged shoreline. Yet, when the woman's body came out of the water, there were no what appeared to be any significant injuries from the rocks. This lack of secondary injury was the key. It was a silent but powerful piece of evidence. It led the police to a single, grim conclusion. As the inspector stated, "We're working on the assumption that the most likely possibility was she went in the water at the blowhole. She had not been washed up, she had been brought here to this exact spot and deliberately placed in the water." With this theory solidifying, the police turned to the public for help. They were in a race against time to identify a victim who had been stripped of all identification. The police held a press conference, confirming to a shocked public that the woman had suffered a violent assault prior to her death. They released a general description, the only details they had. She was an Asian female with an estimated age of between 20 and 35. She was described as having a medium build and shoulder-length hair. They also released the details that were missing. The transcript confirms she has no distinguishing tattoos or scars on her body. All her jewelry had been removed. The killer had systematically erased her identity. Lacking a photograph, the New South Wales Homicide Squad released a computer-generated image of the woman they had found, a digital reconstruction of her face in the hopes that someone, somewhere, would recognize her. And until that happened, she was given a name, a sad, anonymous placeholder, the Snapper Point Blowhole Jane Doe. As the computer-generated image of the Snapper Point Jane Doe began to proliferate, spreading through news broadcasts and across the internet, two separate stories of tragedy began to converge. In the digital forums and social media groups where Michelle's missing person poster was being shared with frantic urgency, a terrible, chilling suspicion began to take root. People who were complete strangers, united only by their shared concern, started to connect the dots. They compared the soft, smiling face in the photos of the missing student with the solemn, digitally rendered features of the unnamed woman found in the water. The similarities in age, in ethnicity, and in the general description were too stark to ignore. The online chatter grew from a whisper to a roar, a wave of public speculation that washed over the two parallel investigations. The speculation, however, was tragically and definitively confirmed by science. The transcript confirms that DNA confirmed that it was the 25-year-old student. With that single devastating result, the anonymous victim was gone. The Snapper Point Jane Doe now had a name, Michelle Leng. The worst fears of her friends and of a mother waiting anxiously for news back in China had been realized. The moment the victim had a name, the entire complexion of the case changed. The investigation accelerated with breathtaking speed. As the transcript notes, things moved quickly. Just a single day after the formal identification, the police had already placed someone under arrest. This rapid progress was the result of an intense and focused police effort that had been quietly building behind the scenes. Detectives immediately re-engaged with everyone in Michelle's life. The transcript states that everyone in Michelle's family and in her close circle had been spoken to at length. These were no longer just conversations about a missing person. They were intense interrogations in a homicide case. At the same time, her apartment, the place she shared with her relatives, was subjected to a rigorous forensic search. It was, as the transcript describes, turned upside down as investigators hunted for any sign of a struggle, any misplaced item, any trace of evidence that could point them to her killer. Her technological evidence, her phone records, her computer, and her social media accounts were all checked thoroughly, creating a digital map of her final days. Amidst the digital forensics and the personal interviews, a more traditional piece of police work yielded the breakthrough. Investigators had been scouring security footage, not just from Michelle's last known movements, but from the area around Snapper Point, and they found it, a single, critical piece of footage. They identified a car that had been captured on camera heading into the national park. The timing was damning. The car was recorded just 4 hours before Michelle's body was found in the water. By tracking that vehicle, they had found their suspect. The man they named was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was not a random attacker she had encountered on the street. He was family. He was her uncle, Derek Barrett. In the ultimate act of chilling deception, he was the very same man who had stood beside his wife in the police station to file the report on the niece he had allegedly already murdered. The transcript adds a few sparse details about the 27-year-old man who was now the center of this horrific case. He had married Michelle's aunt a few years prior. He had a background working in information technology, but for a long time he had been out of work, and he was the person Michelle had trusted, living under the same roof, in the home that should have been her safe haven. With Derek Barrett in custody, the investigation pivoted from the frantic search for a suspect to the methodical and grim task of building an unassailable case against him. The detectives already possessed the damning footage of his car traveling towards the national park, a silent, mechanical witness linking him to the location where Michelle's body was found. But they suspected the true key to his motive, the why behind this horrific act, lay locked inside his personal devices. They seized his phone, a small, everyday object that, they would soon discover, held a record of almost unimaginable darkness. The transcript confirms that after checking Derek's phone, they found some very disturbing pictures. This was not an inference or a suspicion, it was direct, digital proof of what had happened to Michelle inside that apartment. These were not random snapshots. They were, in essence, trophies of his horrific crime. The images documented the terror of Michelle's final hours, captured not in a dark alley or a remote location, but in the supposed sanctuary of her own bedroom. In these sickening photographs, investigators found Michelle bound and gagged on her bed. The images chillingly preserved the cruel details of her captivity. The transcript specifies that she had duct tape and a white cloth fastened around her mouth. These photographs were a profound and sickening violation, a documentation of her helplessness, but from an evidentiary standpoint, they were critical. They provided undeniable proof of her abduction, her false imprisonment, and the timeline of the torment she was forced to endure long before her death. For the hardened investigators and seasoned police officers who were compelled to view these files, the impact was profound and permanent. These were professionals accustomed to the grim realities of violence, yet what they saw shook them. The transcript notes that the police who viewed the images were deeply affected, stating that the expression on her face, as you can only imagine, was one that will stay with them forever. It was the captured, silent look of absolute terror, a final, heartbreaking testament to the nightmare she had been trapped in, all orchestrated by the man she lived with, the man she should have been able to trust implicitly. As this horrifying evidence came to light, Michelle's devastated mother, Mrs. Zhang, could only say that words can't describe the pain she feels over the loss of her only child. A fund was quickly established, a small gesture of compassion from the community to help pay for Michelle's funeral and to provide some measure of care for her grieving mother. Armed with this incontrovertible proof, the legal proceedings against Derek Barrett began. He sat silent in court for the first time as everything was read out. The transcript confirms that he was immediately denied bail. The appalling nature of the allegations, combined with the strength of the photographic evidence, made him an undeniable flight risk and a profound danger to the community. He was remanded in custody, locked away as detectives continued to dig deeper into his life, unearthing the full extent of his predatory behavior. The case against him continued to swell. The transcript states that 2 months later, he was facing yet more charges. This was not a minor, procedural addition. The prosecution, having meticulously reviewed the full contents of his phone and other evidence gathered from the apartment, returned with a staggering indictment. Derek Barrett was now facing 27 charges in fact. These new charges painted a far darker and more complex picture of his actions. They included detaining a person for advantage and multiple counts of indecent assault. This trove of evidence, the photos, the expanded charges, the timeline from the CCTV, and the data from both his and Michelle's phones, allowed the police to construct their official, chilling theory of the crime. They believed they now knew exactly what had happened. Their conclusion was that Michelle was attacked by her uncle almost as soon as she got home that day. The motive was no longer a mystery. The transcript states with grim certainty, the motive was clearly completely sexual. The timeline that investigators pieced together using phone data and security footage painted a picture of calculated, predatory evil. They concluded that Michelle was attacked almost immediately upon her return to the Campsie apartment on that warm Thursday afternoon. The home was empty, providing her attacker with a window of opportunity. It was in her own bedroom, a place that should have been her private sanctuary, that she was restrained and assaulted. But perhaps the most profoundly chilling detail that emerged from the investigation was a moment of horrifying proximity, an instance of what if that almost defies belief. The transcript states that at some point while she was still alive, while she was bound and captive in her room, her cousin arrived home. Michelle's cousin, Derek's wife, was in the apartment. She was moving around her home, separated by only a thin wall, totally unaware that Michelle was captive just feet away. This single, terrifying fact speaks volumes about the silent, calculated control Derek must have wielded and the soundproofed nightmare that Michelle was enduring. This event also highlights the agonizing and dark ambiguity at the very heart of the crime. The transcript confirms that police do not know how long Derek kept her alive for. Did her torment last hours, or did it stretch across the entire weekend? It is a question that, for her family, will likely never be answered. All investigators could do was establish a window of time for her death. They concluded that at some point between 4:45 on Thursday, April 21st, and 10:30 in the morning on Sunday, April 24th, Derek stabbed Michelle to death. After she was gone, his actions shifted from those of a captor to those of a man engaging in a cold, methodical cleanup. The evidence showed that on the morning of April 24th, the same morning her body would later be discovered by that tourist, he wrapped her in plastic. He then set off on the long drive to Snapper Point. He did this, with his phone data tracking him all the way there, a digital betrayer that chronicled his entire journey of disposal. This drive was not a frantic, panicked dash to dispose of evidence. It was something disturbingly composed. The transcript reveals the almost surreal banality of his actions. He stopped to buy some snacks. This small, everyday act, purchasing refreshments while on such a monstrous errand, speaks to a profound and terrifying detachment from reality. After his stop, he carried on to the blowhole and throwing her over the cliff. And in a final, heartbreaking twist, a detail that feels like a deliberate, cruel postscript, the location he chose was not random. It was a place of happy memory for Michelle. The transcript notes with devastating irony that Michelle was thrown into the exact same area she had excitedly taken a photo of and shared to her Instagram a couple of years before. A place she had once visited as a hopeful traveler, a place of beauty she wanted to remember, was chosen by her killer to be her final, violent resting place. In April of the year 2016, the case of Michelle Leng's murder officially entered the court system. Derek Barrett, the man who should have been her protector, was formally charged with her murder. As he stood before the court, any hope for a quick resolution or a confession was immediately extinguished. When asked for his plea, he uttered the two words that would prolong the family's agony and set the stage for a grueling legal battle: not guilty. This denial, in the face of the horrifying photographic evidence found on his own phone, was a staggering act of defiance. It signaled that he intended to fight the charges, forcing the prosecution to prove every single element of the horrific crime he was accused of. Michelle's family, devastated by the news of her discovery, had boarded a plane and flown in from China, their lives shattered. They were a world away from home, grappling with an incomprehensible loss in a foreign land, and now they were forced to navigate a complex legal system. The transcript states they made sure to be at every court appearance. They became a constant, silent presence in the courtroom, their grief a heavy, palpable force in the room, their attendance a solemn vow to bear witness and see justice done for their daughter. The courtroom itself became the stage for a scene of almost unbearable, tragic irony. The transcript describes the image of Michelle Leng's distraught mother, a woman hollowed out by pain, sitting in the courtroom, and who was by her side, offering physical and emotional support. It was the wife of the man accused of fatally stabbing her daughter. Michelle's aunt, a woman caught in an impossible, nightmarish position, was publicly supporting her grieving sister-in-law, even as her own husband sat in the dock, accused of the monstrous act that had destroyed their family. It was a heart-wrenching tableau of two women, both betrayed, united in a shared, unspeakable sorrow. This case did not exist in a vacuum. It exploded into the public consciousness, both in Australia and internationally. The media presence was intense. The transcript notes that back in China, Michelle's murder has made national headlines. This was not just a local crime story. It was a terrifying cautionary tale that struck a chord of fear in thousands of families. The transcript explains that a lot of international students in Sydney and their parents in China were really concerned. Michelle's story was their worst nightmare made real. She had done everything right, she had family, she was a diligent student, she lived in a supposedly safe home, and yet she had been horrifically violated and murdered. While Michelle's family sat in dignified, heartbreaking silence, Derek Barrett's legal team began to mount their defense. His lawyer spoke to the press, painting a picture of a man who was himself a victim of the circumstances. The lawyer claimed his client was not coping well in jail and was steadfastly denying the allegations against him. In a statement that seemed to drip with detachment from the brutality of the crime, the lawyer said obviously he is very upset, shocked. The defense's complaints did not stop there. His lawyer went on to critique the conditions of his client's incarceration, stating that he's not finding the Sydney Police Center particularly attractive. The lawyer described the jail as a terrible place to be incarcerated. This focus on the attractiveness of the jail and the comfort of the accused man stood in stark, chilling contrast to the unimaginable terror Michelle had faced, bound and gagged in her own bed, and the violent, brutal end she met at the Snapper Point blowhole. The legal posturing had begun, and with a plea of not guilty on the table, Michelle's family could only brace themselves for the long and agonizing fight for justice that lay ahead. For 18 long and agonizing months, Michelle's family endured the slow, grinding pace of the legal system, all under the shadow of Derek Barrett's plea of not guilty. They sat through every appearance, bracing themselves for the trauma of a full trial, a public spectacle where the horrifying details of Michelle's final days would be dissected, debated, and denied. Then, in December of the year 2017, just as the complex machinery of a murder trial was gearing up, the defense abruptly changed course. Derek Barrett finally pleaded guilty. This was not a reluctant admission to a lesser charge. It was a full and complete capitulation. He admitted to the entire, horrifying narrative that the police had so meticulously pieced together. He admitted to binding and gagging Michelle before murdering her and dumping her body. But the confession did not stop there. The full, sickening scope of his predatory behavior, hidden on his phone, was now laid bare in his own plea. The transcript confirms that Derek also pleaded guilty to 21 other offenses. These additional charges were a chilling window into his obsession. They included 19 counts of filming Michelle for sexual gratification. He had not just documented her final, terror-filled hours, he had been a secret voyeur in her life, violating her privacy long before the final, fatal assault. He also admitted to detaining a person with intent to obtain advantage and 3 counts of committing an act of indecency with a person over 16 years of age. The mask was off. The why was now sickeningly clear. With the what and how now confessed, Barrett's legal team shifted its focus to offering an explanation, a mitigating narrative for these monstrous acts. Derek claimed he had substance problems, the transcript states. This was the defense's new foundation. A story of a man lost to addiction. He claimed that around the time of her murder, he had been using methamphetamine and smoking synthetic cannabis. Flowing from this claim of rampant drug use came the inevitable defense of amnesia. He claimed he had no memory of anything that had happened that weekend, the transcript reports. The entire period, the binding, the assault, the filming, the murder, the drive to the coast, the disposal of her body, was, he alleged, a complete and total blank. The only thing he could recall, he insisted, was a single, detached, and hauntingly cinematic image, seeing his face in the mirror and blood in the sink. It was a memory devoid of a victim, a memory that centered only on himself and the abstract evidence of what he had done. This performance of a drug-addled man, bewildered by his own actions, did not land with the court. But the judge rejected these claims, the transcript notes bluntly. His behavior in court, his attempts to show remorse, were not seen as genuine. The judge declared that his distress seemed somewhat contrived. The defense's narrative was further dismantled by expert testimony. A forensic psychologist, identified as Dr. F., took the stand and told the court that, in his professional opinion, Derek had feigned amnesia as a way of avoiding taking responsibility. The psychologist then directly attacked the foundation of Barrett's claim. The transcript quotes the doctor's blunt and damning assessment. Derek claiming he was suffering from a methamphetamine addiction just did not ring true. He then added a sharp, visceral observation. I have not seen an obese methamphetamine addict. The psychologist's final summary was scathing. He testified that Derek exhibited a lack of insight into his crimes and a lack of empathy. These were not the chaotic, impulsive actions of a man lost in a drug-fueled haze. The expert concluded that taking images of the victim bound and gagged with a look of horror prior to her death and disposing of her body a long distance away were actions highly suggestive of sexual deviance. The guilty plea was in, but the transparent excuse for his evil had been utterly and professionally rejected. In what appeared to be a final, calculated performance aimed at securing a more lenient sentence, Derek Barrett took one last opportunity to cast himself as a man tormented, not by his actions, but by his own vague problems. He wrote a letter to Michelle's mom, a document that would be presented to the court. It began with a hollow and superficial acknowledgement of the incomprehensible pain he had inflicted. "I can only imagine what you are going through from your loss." He then moved quickly to his own supposed suffering, writing, "Every moment of my life, I wish I could go back in time and take back that day that has caused so much pain." He continued to deflect personal responsibility, framing the horrific event as a consequence of his ambiguous personal failings, stating, "I let my own problems spill into the family home, and they paid dearly as a result." He attempted to paint a portrait of a man racked with guilt, claiming, "This moment in my life has kept me awake at night in tears, and I still have nightmares." Then, in a truly stunning act of minimization, he referred to the days-long ordeal of abduction, torture, sexual assault, and murder as a stupid weekend. He desperately clung to the amnesia defense that the court's own psychologist had already dismantled. "My perception of time around that period is hazy," he insisted. He wrote of his supposed inner turmoil, claiming, "You have no idea how it frustrates me every day trying to think of how this came about and why I went down this path." He concluded this performance of self-pity with the lines, "I betrayed my own family and hers for my actions. I disgusted myself." If this letter was an audition for mercy, it failed spectacularly. Justice Helen Wilson wasn't buying his words. She saw the letter, and his entire courtroom demeanor, for exactly what it was. The transcript notes her sharp observation. "He had the air in the witness box of someone playing a part." She declared that he was simply saying what he thought he should say to present the best possible impression of himself. The act was transparent, and the time for games was over. In delivering her sentence, Justice Wilson refused to acknowledge the weak character he had attempted to portray. Instead, she spoke the truth of his actions. She labeled the crime for what it was, a despicable crime of extreme brutality and great wickedness. She did not mince words, calling it a depraved and sadistic act. She then drove home the absolute horror of his betrayal, emphasizing that this act was committed by a man in a position of trust to Miss Leng. She highlighted the violation of the sanctity of her home, stating it occurred in a place that should have been one of safety and refuge for her. Her final, scathing summary of the man standing before her was absolute. She defined him as a socially inadequate man driven by sexual perversion and sadism. As the transcript so bluntly puts it, Derek Barrett didn't fool anyone. During this entire devastating pronouncement, Derek Barrett stared intently at the floor of the dock throughout the entire sentence. The transcript makes one last, sharp observation of his character. His tears now only for himself. Derek Barrett was sentenced to 46 years in prison. The judge set a non-parole period of 34 years. While this was not technically a life sentence, the reality of the numbers was stark. He could be in his 70s before he is free again. Justice, in this moment, was measured in decades. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. Derek Barrett was in prison, serving a sentence that would see him locked away for decades. The family, while shattered, had the cold comfort of a guilty plea and a long sentence. But the investigation had shown he had a growing sexual obsession with her, and a couple of years later, the full, sickening extent of that obsession would be unearthed in the most random and chilling of ways. In November of the year 2019, an elderly, housebound woman with dementia was sitting in her house when her daughter knocked on the door to check on her. The daughter entered and found her mother at the kitchen table, holding something in her hand. The transcript describes it as a heavy-duty weatherproof USB. When the daughter asked where it came from, her mother, in her fog of dementia, gave a simple, innocent answer. She said she thought it was a toy and could not explain how she got it. Puzzled, the daughter took the USB drive and plugged the USB into the computer. What she saw in those next few moments was so disturbing, so horrific, that she called police right away. The drive contained 9 video files, which amounted to over an hour in total, and 13 pictures. The content of these files was the missing piece of the puzzle, the raw, unfiltered record of Michelle's final, terrifying ordeal. It was Derek and Michelle. He had not just taken photographs. He had filmed himself raping and torturing Michelle as he held her captive in her room. The footage was a document of pure sadism. One video showed Michelle's hands so tightly bound that they were swollen and turning purple. At one point, in a moment of unimaginable terror for Michelle, Derek cut the tape off with a large hunting knife, but this was no act of mercy. He merely retied her hands, and with a chilling, casual cruelty, said to his captive niece, "Now, where were we?" And then, he continued his vicious assault. The drive also contained the archive of his long-held obsession. Derek had also filmed Michelle and his stepdaughter over a period of time before the murder, capturing them in their most private, vulnerable moments, doing things like showering and sleeping. In some of these sickening videos, he was touching himself as he watched them sleep. The police, now in possession of this horrifying new evidence, were able to connect it directly to Barrett. They were able to match some photos on the USB to ones Derek had deleted from his phone just days before his arrest as he tried to cover his crimes. But one mystery remained, and it is a part of the case that, as the transcript notes, is really still a mystery for now. The elderly woman who had the USB had no discernible connection to Derek. The only link was a geographic echo. She did live a few miles from the house Derek used to live in. How that crucial, weatherproof drive, containing the very soul of his evil, made its way from his possession to her kitchen table is unknown. This new evidence was not just a horrifying addendum, it was a new criminal case. As a result of everything found on the USB, 17 new charges were laid against him. These were not minor offenses. They included multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault and indecent assault. This new development also shed a tragic light on the family dynamic. The transcript notes that Michelle's aunt spent a lot of time in Wollongong for work, and as a result, she was not around when so much of this with her husband was going on. She had no idea of the secret, predatory life her husband was living under her own roof. When the truth was revealed, she was riddled with guilt. But the most profound pain, as ever, was reserved for Michelle's mother, May. When she received the call from the police, informing her not just of the drive's existence, but of its contents, she said she almost passed out. In a tearful statement, she tried to put the unimaginable into words. When the police told me the video clip showed how my daughter was degradingly raped, agonizingly tortured, a wave of faint immediately washed over me. And in a final, heartbreaking revelation of cascading tragedy, she shared that the horror had claimed another victim. My healthy mother, she said, referring to Michelle's grandmother, was in such grief that she too passed away not long after receiving the news. The shockwaves of Derek's evil had taken another life, shattering the family completely. Derek Barrett pleaded guilty to all 17 offenses. But for Michelle's family, who had once again braced themselves for a legal fight, the outcome was a source of profound disappointment. He did not receive a new separate sentence. He was already a convicted murderer, and the law, in this instance, had its hands tied. The judge, in sentencing him for these new horrific crimes, was blunt. The transcript states the judge went as far as saying if the full extent of his perverted crime was known in 2017, he would have been jailed for life. But, she explained, that simply wasn't possible now. The legal reasoning was a bitter pill for the family to swallow. The law doesn't allow one to revisit a sentence that was imposed in 2017. Because the evidence was not found before the original trial, it could only be considered a new aggravating fact, not a new, separate crime for which he could be consecutively punished. So, she sentenced him to an additional 20 years in prison. However, this new sentence will be served concurrently with his murder sentence. In practical terms, this meant his 46-year overall sentence remains the same. The only tangible change was a small one. 2 years was added to his minimum non-parole period. The transcript states, in a detail that is as confusing as it is tragic, that he will now be eligible for parole in 2022 instead of 2050. This case is truly one of the most twisted and depraved we have ever looked at. Michelle Leng was a hardworking, hopeful person, thousands of miles away from home, trying to better herself and give her and her mom a comfortable life one day. She was working in a place she thought was safe, living with people she trusted. For her mother, who first lost her husband and then her daughter at the hands of someone she called family, it has been the darkest of times. Her final words on the matter encapsulate a grief that is bottomless. We even today still cannot accept the fact that she has left us and we are still in great suffering. Now that my child is gone, my whole life is shattered. What is going to happen to me? This has been an incredibly difficult and dark story to recount, but it is one that demanded to be told. Thank you for joining us today, for bearing witness to the life of Michelle Leng and the devastating injustice she endured. We hope to see you again next time.